She had seen men like him before, not like him exactly, not with that stillness, not with that particular quality of danger that filled a room the way smoke fills a building, slow and invisible until suddenly you couldn't breathe. But she had seen powerful men brought low by their own bodies. She had seen mayors and executives and men whose names appeared in newspapers stripped down to their most human form by illness, by injury, by the simple and undefeatable fact that flesh is flesh regardless of who lives inside it. She had seen kings reduced to patience. Amara Cole had 8 years in a trauma bay, and she had learned that a hospital gown was the great equalizer. What she had not counted on was a man who refused to be equalized. He came in at 2 in the morning bleeding through a pressed black shirt, carried by 2 enormous men who looked at her like she was a problem they hadn't planned for. She was the only nurse on site. The regular night staff had some kind of family emergency. The agency hadn't elaborated and she hadn't asked. She was the replacement. She showed up, she assessed, she got to work. That was how she had always operated. Questions came after the patient was stable. Sometimes they never came at all. She got him stable in 40 minutes. Bullet wound to the left side, clean entry, no organ damage, significant blood loss, but nothing that couldn't be managed. She worked fast and she worked clean. The 2 men who had carried him in stood against the wall the entire time, watching her with the particular intensity of people who were deciding in real time whether to trust her. She didn't notice. Or rather, she noticed, and it didn't matter. She was looking at her patient. When she finally had a moment to look at him, really look at him, past the wound and the blood pressure and the oxygen saturation, she noticed the dragon tattoo first. Black ink climbing from his chest up his neck, intricate and deliberate, rendered with the kind of detail that takes hours. It was not the tattoo of someone who had made an impulsive decision at 22. It was the tattoo of a man who had chosen something permanent and meant it. She noticed the jaw next. The quality of his face, even unconscious, composed, severe, built for command, the kind of face that gave nothing away even in sleep. And then she noticed the man standing in the corner who had not taken his eyes off her since she walked in. "He's stable," she said without turning around. "You can breathe." Man, Marco, she would learn later, exhaled for what sounded like the first time in several hours. She did not sleep that night. She charted, she monitored, she sat in the particular quiet of a clinic that felt less like a medical facility and more like a safe house wearing a medical facility's clothes. By 6 a.m. she had put together, with reasonable accuracy, what kind of place this was and what kind of man she had spent the night keeping alive. By 7 a.m. she had decided it didn't change anything. She was a nurse. He was a patient. A wound didn't care about the person it lived in, and neither, in the most essential sense, did she. He woke up at 8:43 a.m. and immediately tried to get out of bed. She put her hand flat on his chest and pushed him back down. Not gently, firmly, the way you do when you've done it 1,000 times, and you know that gentle doesn't work with men who have spent their whole lives confusing motion with control. The motion says I'm fine. The motion says I'm in charge. The motion says don't look too closely at what's underneath. She had seen it more times than she could count. "Tear the stitches," she said. He looked at her hand. Then he looked at her face. Something passed across his expression that she couldn't quite categorize, not anger, not surprise exactly. Something more like recalibration, like a man running a system that had just encountered data it didn't have a category for and was deciding in real time how to process it. "My phone," he said. His voice was low and even, accustomed to being obeyed. "After I check your vitals," his jaw tightened. "I don't think you understand who." "Blood pressure, oxygen, wound inspection," she said, already reaching for the cuff. "In that order, then your phone." He was silent. Behind her she heard Marco shift his weight, a small sound, a preparatory sound, the sound of a large man about to take a step. She held up one finger without turning around. "One more step in this direction, and this clinic receives an anonymous call to the State Health Board before noon." The weight settled back. Dominic Caruso, head of the Caruso crime family, said nothing at all. She checked his vitals. She checked the wound. She made her notes. Then she reached into the folded pile of his belongings on the side table and handed him his phone without comment. He took it, but he didn't look at it right away. He was looking at her. If you're enjoying this story so far, go ahead and like this video. It helps more people find stories like this one, and it means the world to this channel. Over the next 24 hours, he tried everything in his arsenal. He led with money, triple her standard rate, he said, to be cooperative with his recovery process. She told him that cooperating with his medical care was already her job description, and that she was already being paid for it. and that his offer was noted and declined. He went cold after that. It was a specific kind of cold, the cold of a man who has learned that when words fail you, silence and stillness can do the work instead. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. His eyes went flat and distant. She had seen that particular performance from doctors who didn't like being questioned, from administrators who expected deference, from men in waiting rooms who had decided that the person across from them was beneath them. She hummed to herself and updated his chart. She could feel him watching her with an expression she didn't look up to confirm. She had a theory about men like this, that the performance of coldness was almost always about heat, that the stillness was covering something that moved. She kept the theory to herself. By the end of the first day, Marco had pulled her into the corridor with the expression of a man who was genuinely trying to work something out. He told her quietly, with the slightly stunned delivery of someone reporting on a thing they had witnessed but not yet fully believed, that he had been with Dominic Caruso for 15 years, that in 15 years he had never seen anyone speak to him the way she did, and then simply continue. Continue breathing, continue working, continue existing in the same room with him as though nothing remarkable had happened. He wasn't threatening her, he was careful to make that clear. He seemed, if anything, unsettled in a way that had nothing to do with menace. He paused before he said the last part. He doesn't let people close, Marco said. When he does, it gets complicated for everyone involved. She thanked him. She went back to check the IV line. She did not tell him that she wasn't trying to get close to anyone. She was trying to do her job. She was not in the business of complicated. She had learned, not theoretically, but through actual and specific loss, that complicated had a way of becoming grief, and she had already carried more grief than she had planned for by this point in her life. But hospitals have a way of dismantling the careful structures people build around themselves. The late hours, the enforced stillness, the particular and irreducible vulnerability of a person who cannot leave, who cannot control what their body does, who is dependent in ways they are not accustomed to being dependent. She had watched it happen hundreds of times. People became more honest in hospitals, more themselves. The performance wore thin, the edges of things showed. She had watched it happen to patients. She had not considered it might happen to her too. On the third night she thought he was asleep. She stepped into the hallway and stood with her back against the wall and closed her eyes for 60 seconds. She did this sometimes, not to rest, but to visit. There was a boy. 17 years old, brought in on a Tuesday night 6 months ago, and she had done everything correctly, had followed every protocol, had made every right decision in the right order at the right time, and it had not been enough and he had died anyway, and she still did not know what to do with that. He visited her at 3 a.m. with reliable frequency. She had stopped fighting it. She just gave him the 60 seconds and then went back to work. When she returned to the room, Dominic's eyes were open. He was looking at her from across the space with an expression she couldn't fully read, not pity, she didn't think, and she would not have accepted pity, something quieter than that. Recognition, maybe, the look of one person acknowledging another person's weight without asking them to explain it. He didn't ask. She didn't explain. She went back to the chart. But the quality of the silence in the room had changed. It had a different texture than it had before, something that acknowledged without language the way two people can sometimes understand each other well before they have earned the right to. It was on day 4 that he asked her, not ordered, asked. And she noticed the difference, because with him, the difference was not subtle. It was the difference between a command moving through the air and a question, genuine and slightly uncertain, from a man who was not entirely sure he was doing it correctly. He asked why she had become a nurse. She almost didn't answer. She had a rule about personal information with patients, clean professional line, consistently applied, no exceptions. It wasn't unfriendliness, it was self-preservation. She had found over 8 years that the line between patient and something more complicated than patient got crossed precisely when she stopped maintaining it, but something in the way he asked was different. There was no performance in it, no angle she could identify. He was looking at her with the slightly clumsy directness of a person who was accustomed to taking what they wanted and was discovering, somewhat late in life, that some things had to be asked for. She told him about her brother. The heart condition diagnosed when he was 4 years old. The years that followed, hospitals as familiar as home, more familiar in some ways, the particular smell of antiseptic and recycled air, the sound of monitors that she learned to interpret before she was old enough to drive. She had become fluent in a language she had never wanted to learn. By the time she was 16, she could tell from the sound of the beep whether a nurse was about to come running or whether the number on the screen just needed watching. She had learned it because knowing was better than not knowing, because knowing meant she could prepare, because there was nothing worse than being caught off guard by something you might have seen coming. He listened. He didn't interject, didn't redirect, didn't offer solutions or commentary. He just listened, with the focused and unhurried attention of someone for whom listening was not the default mode, but who was choosing it, deliberately, for reasons she suspected he didn't fully have language for yet. When she finished, he said, "You chose this," she said. "Some of us did." Silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it. Make sure you subscribe if you want to see how this ends. We post new stories every single week, and you don't want to miss what happens next. On the fifth night, she found him standing at the window. He had gotten up on his own, against every instruction she had given him, against every note in his chart, and he was standing at the glass in the dark looking out at the city below. She should have ordered him back immediately. She should have made a note. She should have done a great number of things that she did not do. Instead, she crossed the room and stood beside him and looked out at whatever he was looking at. It was the city, just the city. Streets and lights, and the ordinary ongoing motion of the world going about its business in the dark. After a long time, he said, "I have been in control of everything since I was 19 years old." She considered that. 19 was very young to take on the weight he was describing. She didn't say that. She said, "That sounds exhausting." He turned and looked at her. In the low light from the window, she could see the dragon tattoo at his collar, the sharp line of his jaw, the dark fall of his hair, and the particular expression of a man standing at the edge of a feeling he does not have a name for. Like someone who has driven the same road for 20 years and has suddenly noticed there is a turn he has never taken. She was already looking at him. He reached up slowly, with a slowness that was deliberate, that was a question being asked in a language they had not agreed to speak yet, and tucked a loose coil of her hair back from her face. The backs of his fingers brushed her cheekbone. His hand stayed for a moment, warm, completely steady. A man whose hands were steadier than his expression. She didn't move away. The moment held itself in place. The clinic was quiet around them. Outside, a car passed and its headlights swept across the ceiling, and for one strange, suspended instant, the room was full of moving light and shadow, and neither of them breathed, and the whole world seemed to be waiting for something. Then her pager went off. She stepped back. He lowered his hand. They did not speak about what had just happened. She went to answer the page. He went back to bed without being told. She lay awake in the break room 2 hours later, looking at the ceiling tiles, her heart doing something she had given it explicit and repeated instructions not to do, feeling something she had last felt a long time ago and had been careful, since then, not to feel again. She didn't know what to do with careful anymore. By the next morning, the world had found them. Marco told Dominic first, and then Dominic told her himself, which she noted, that he had chosen to tell her himself rather than send Marco. The Vega family had a man inside the clinic, had known for at least 2 days. There were people stationed outside watching the building. The kind of people, Marco added, with a look at Amara that was heavy with meaning, who did not trouble themselves to make distinctions between a primary target and anyone standing within range of him. Dominic's first words, his very first response, before any discussion of exit strategy or tactical response or what came next, were, "Get her out." She refused. She stood in the center of the room with her arms folded and told him, with complete clarity, that he was not medically cleared for unsupported transport, that she would not leave a patient who could not safely be moved. That whatever quarrel the Vega family had with the Caruso family was not a medical problem and was therefore not her problem, and that if he wanted to argue about it, he was welcome to try, but she had been argued with by people who were much better at it than him, and she was still standing. He crossed the room in 3 steps and took her arm. Not roughly, carefully, a hold that was controlled and deliberate. She could feel the restraint in it. He brought his face close to hers and said, "You do not understand what these men will do." She looked at his hand on her arm. She looked at him. She said, "You do not understand what I do. I don't leave patients." A long pause. Something moved through his face. He let go. Comment below, are you Team Amara, or do you think she should have walked out the door when she still could? When the Vega men came through the back entrance, it happened the way these things always happened, faster than thinking, louder than expected, the world going from tense but still to chaos in less than a second. She heard shouting in the corridor, then the sound that no building is designed to contain. She did not wait to be told what to do. She had identified the interior room on day 2, old habit from years of emergency planning, from drills and protocols, and the constant background awareness of where the exits were and where the safest spaces were, and what she would do if the situation that wasn't supposed to happen happened anyway. She moved Dominic there without being asked. He came without argument, which told her something about how seriously he was taking it. She pulled the door shut and wedged a chair under the handle. In the dark, with the sounds of the hallway outside telling a story she could follow without seeing it, she felt him find her hand. She let him take it. His grip was firm and warm and not desperate, the grip of someone who was afraid and refusing to let the fear run the situation. She understood that. It was how she held things too. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was low. "I'm sorry you're in this." "Stop apologizing," she said. "Tell me how we get out." When the door broke open, she saw, for the first time, who Dominic Caruso was when the control wasn't composure but action. He was in front of her before she had processed that he had moved, injured, slower than he would have been at full strength, but with a certainty and a precision that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with intention. He was a man who had been trained by danger and had trained himself further until this specific terrible thing was something his body knew how to do without instruction. It was over in moments. He turned immediately, not to assess the room, not to check the door, not to do any of the things she might have expected. He turned to look at her. Before he looked at his own wound, which had torn open again and was bleeding darkly through the bandage, he looked at her face, checking for shock. Checking that she was whole, she noted that. She put it somewhere she hadn't planned to put anything. In the aftermath, when his men had moved through the building and the immediate threat had been contained, and the strange, fragile quiet of after-violence had settled over everything, she sat him down and restitched him. She worked in silence. He let her. He didn't flinch and he didn't speak, and he watched her face while she worked with the same focused attention he had given her voice earlier, storing something, she thought, against a future he wasn't sure he was going to be allowed. When she finished and set down her instruments, she sat back and said, "You're cleared for discharge." He looked at her. Something in his face asked a question that he didn't put into words for a moment. Then he said, "Is that what you want?" She took her time. Outside the room, his men were reasserting order, voices, movement, the sound of a world reorganizing itself back into structure. In a few hours, this room would be clean. The sheets would be changed. The chart would go into whatever system this clinic used, and the record of the last 6 days would be reduced to numbers and timestamps. There would be no evidence in this building that anything had happened between them, she said. "What I want doesn't live in this building." He sat up slowly, careful of the new stitches. His eyes didn't leave her face. "Then where does it live?" She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the window, the 60 seconds of headlight moving across the ceiling, the warmth of his hand in the dark, the way he had turned to check her face before his own wound. "Somewhere," she said, "that you'd have to be a different kind of dangerous to find." She left before he could answer. She always left first. It was one of her rules, had been for years, the rule that kept complicated from becoming loss. She walked out of the building into the early morning and got into her car and drove home and did not let herself think about what she was leaving behind. She was mostly unsuccessful. The days after were ordinary in the way that days are sometimes deliberately ordinary. She worked her shifts. She checked her monitors. She ate and slept and moved through the routines that had held her life together for years. She did not look at her phone with any particular expectation. She told herself this with some regularity. She thought about him at 3 a.m. She thought about the window. She thought about a man who had controlled everything since he was 19 years old, and what it might cost a person to live that way for that long with no one allowed close enough to notice. She thought, "That is not my problem." She thought about it anyway. 3 weeks later, she was making dinner on a Tuesday evening when someone knocked at her door. She wasn't expecting anyone. She set down the spoon and crossed to the door and looked through the peephole the way she always did. 8 years of night shifts had installed a reflex for it that she no longer had to consciously execute. He was standing in the hallway in a dark jacket, no entourage, no suited men at the edges of the frame. Just him, the dragon tattoo visible above his collar. His hair slightly different from the clinic, less controlled, falling across his forehead in a way that made him look younger. He was holding a white paper bag in both hands like someone who had prepared for this moment and was discovering that preparation had not made it less frightening. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, uncertain. She opened the door. He held up the bag. "I looked up what nurses eat when they're off duty," he said. "The internet had a great deal of strong and conflicting opinions. I didn't know which sources to trust. So you bought all of them." It seemed like the most reasonable approach given the available information. She looked at him, at the bag, at the careful way he was holding it, like it was the most important object he had handled in recent memory, which perhaps she thought it was. She thought about what it had cost him to come here, not the risk of it, not the logistics, but the specific vulnerability of standing in someone's hallway holding takeout and not knowing what happened next. For a man who had not known what happened next in a very long time. "I don't know how to do this," he said, not an excuse, a fact offered plainly without performance. "I know," she said. She stepped aside and let him in. He walked past her into the light and warmth of her apartment, and she closed the door behind him and stood for a moment with her hand still on the handle, deciding something. She decided it quickly. She had always been good at deciding things quickly when it mattered. She turned around. He was standing in the middle of her living room, looking around at the space, at the books on the shelves, and the plants on the windowsill and the half-made dinner on the stove, with an expression that was open and careful and very, very still, like a man who had just stepped into a room he had not known existed and was trying to learn it without disturbing it. "Down," she said. He sat. She went back to the stove. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The apartment was warm. Outside, the city continued its ordinary business. Inside, something new and tentative and entirely unplanned was beginning to locate itself in the space between two people who had not expected to need each other. She handed him a plate. He took it. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him. Sitting at her table, dragon tattoo at his collar, holding a plate with both hands like someone who was learning the weight of small things. "Welcome," she said. And for the first time, the very first time, they sat together in a room that belonged to neither of them and both of them, and began the complicated and frightening work of beginning. If this story moved you, subscribe and drop a comment below. Tell me what you think happens next between Amara and Dominic. Do you think he can become that different kind of dangerous? I'll see you in the next story.